Let's talk about Xi and Biden. What would be your take on them and their meeting?
Well, it was a really interesting announcement Wednesday night, I guess it was, that Mr. Biden and Mr. Xi are going to get together at the meeting in Bali, in Indonesia. The way that Mr. Biden dismissed the notion that Xi is, as Xi has said, Biden, not Biden's, but Putin's best friend. uh, they've met something like 28 times over the past few years, physically or by Zoom. They're very close. As a matter of fact, China and Russia have never been closer in their entire history. And I can speak to that since my first portfolio at the CIA analysis shop was to watch Sino-Soviet relations. This was in the early 60s, and it was clear that they hated each other. They had a big ideological dispute for leadership of the world communist movement, but they also had territorial grievances. China was claiming 1.5 thousand square kilometers of Siberia, claiming that the Russians acquired those under unequal treaties going back to the 17th century, Treaty of Nerchinsk. Was that a valid claim? Yeah. Were they unequal treaties? Yeah, they sure as hell were. And the Chinese were pressing that. There was shooting across the riverine border there, the Amur and the Usuri rivers, dividing the two countries. What else? Well, they were actually in such rivalry that when Russia thought it necessary to help Vietnam, I'm talking about North Vietnam, the Vietnamese communists, with some rudimentary supplies, China prevented Russia from doing that, prevented those supplies coming to a socialist ally from going through China. Why? Well, because China didn't want Russia to be able to claim leadership, the big defender of the world communist movement, including communist Vietnam. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that this animus, this contest between two communist countries was of overriding importance. So much so that we ran into a lot of problems with old school troglodytes who said, McGovern, you're getting sucked in here. They're both commies, for God's sake. This is all a sham. They're all making this stuff up to deceive us into thinking that it's real, Well, we didn't have much to go on. One thing we had was that we intercepted radio signals, radio broadcasts from Russia to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. What those radio broadcasts indicate? That the Russians were stirring up trouble, stirring up insurrections in Xinjiang, of course, part of China. Well, that seemed to be real, but that didn't convince these people. They're both commies. Well, then, luckily, we had these satellites that would fly over like once or twice a day, and every now and then they would pick up some photography on the Sino-Soviet border, take it back to Rochester, have it developed. Our analysts go up there, and I got a call from Rochester. Ray, you're going to be happy with our interpretation of what we just photographed. And I said, why? We found 15 advanced Soviet divisions on the Chinese border. Oh, Well, that sort of convinced a couple of people, but not all of them. They all say, well, they're both coming. So the next thing that happened, this is a little vignette here. It's interesting. It shows how intelligence can be used or misused. Um, One of these images, one of the photography pieces that we got was showed a MiG-19 on the apron of the Shenyang in China airframe plant. Now, MiG-19 was pretty advanced in those days. We're talking 1964, 65, around there, okay? MiG-19 was almost state-of-the-art. MiG-21 hadn't even been developed, okay? So these guys came to us, they said, ha, see? If they hate each other, why is Russia giving China a MiG-19? And we said, well, isn't it on the apron of a Chinese airframe plant in Shenyang? Yeah, that's right. Well, maybe the Chinese are making it themselves. And these very, very smart guys said, they can't be making it themselves. And we said, why? Because there's snow on the roof. Oh, you mean, yeah, that's right. If you're making these things, especially in the winter, you're going to have to get heat in there. Shenyang gets pretty cold, okay? So they can't be making it because there's snow on the roof. So we threw up our hands. Some people you can never convince, right? Well, then 3 years later, we got a Chinese refugee come through our defector center. He was from Shenyang. And guess what? We found out that he worked at that airframe plant. So we asked him, were you there in the early 60s? What do you remember about it? He said, oh, it was awful. We had to wear 3 or 4 overcoats, and it was just terrible because there was no heating in this plant, and we were producing MiG-19s. So, yeah, there you go, Snow in the roof doesn't negate all the other information that we had. That the Russians and the Chinese hated each other. The Russians were not giving China MiG-19s. China was making MiG-19s themselves, okay? And what else? Well, trade between Russia and China back in those days, it was all of $200 million annual trade. Whoa, not much, okay? What is it going to be next year? Would you believe 200 billion? Now, I've done the math, and I had it checked with my mathematician sons. That's 1,000 times. 1,000 times annual trade turnover than was the case back in the 60s. That means something. So we were wrong when we thought that they would hate each other forever because there was a common enemy developing, and that enemy was the United States, the United Kingdom, people who wanted to keep both Russia and China down. Back in April of last year, 2021, Biden all of a sudden asked Putin, well, let's have a summit. I mean, this situation in Ukraine is worrying, it's bothering, let's have a summit. And so they had a summit in Geneva. Now, we don't know much about what happened at that summit, except Biden decided to say things right after the summit that same afternoon. And what he said was this: it's not appropriate for me to talk about what I told Putin, but, China is being squeezed. I'm sorry. Russia is being squeezed by China. There's this long, several thousand-mile border between the two countries. Russia knows that China aspires not only to be the biggest economic giant in the world, but also a military power. Putin's got a lot to worry about. He's being squeezed by China. Well, that was June 16 of last year, 2021. 2021. Now, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall after Putin heard that and consulted his advisors and said, huh? Doesn't Biden realize? Don't those advisors that are telling Biden what's up, don't they realize that China and Russia are together in a very, very close embrace? It's not a squeeze. It's a fraternal embrace, okay? No more communist stuff. I mean, China's not communist anymore, let's face it. So why do I mention that? I mention that because after June 16 last year, the Chinese and the Russians did everything they possibly could to try to educate, to try to enlighten Biden to the fact that they were standing together, that they had a virtual alliance. And indeed, on the 15th of December last year, Xi Jinping, the president of China, described their strategic relationship as something that exceeds the normal alliance between two countries. Exceeds, that's the word. Goes farther than, okay? So, what do I mention all that? Well, because there was some question as to whether China would support Russia in Europe. China likes to tend to its own affairs. It's got lots of experience, like 4 or 5 millennia. It doesn't like to get involved in foreign machinations, and so it was highly unusual. It was kind of a real puzzle to see what China might do. Long story short, when Putin saw he was not getting anywhere in trying to persuade the United States, it's usually people say the United States and NATO, but it's really the United States that's calling the shots, so that's what I'll use here. Putin could not persuade the United States that he suffered an existential threat if Ukraine became part of NATO, if U.S. missile bases went into Ukraine, as the holes in Romania and Poland already exist. There could be missiles put in there 5 to 7 to 10 minutes away from Moscow, okay? So what Putin did, he went to Xi up in Beijing at the start of the Olympics. That was the 4th of February this year, 2022. And he said, I'm not getting, no, I don't, this is my reasoning as to how this evolved. He said, Mr. Xi, best friend Xi, the West is not taking me seriously. The U.S. is not negotiating in good faith. Matter of fact, thousands of NATO-trained troops are arrayed against Donetsk and Lugansk. They're about to pounce on those countries after killing maybe 10, 12,000 of our fellow Russian stock people. The Nazis are running wild there. We call them proto-Nazis or neo-Nazis, but they're followers of Stepan Bandera, and they're really running the roost there. So, Mr. Xi, I don't know how to say this, but I think I may have to invade Ukraine. Now, my notion of how Xi reacted to that was, you mean after the Olympics are over, right? Right, okay. The Olympics are over on the 20th of February. On the 21st of February, Donetsk and Lugansk are recognized as independent countries by Russia. And on the 24th, of course, Russian forces go into Lugansk and Donetsk to defend them and to drive out the neo-Nazis. Now, what does it mean? Well, that was a shock. Nobody expected Xi to approve that. I mean, maybe approve is a little bit too much, but at least he condoned it, because look what he's done since. They've actually supported Russia. They've actually said, look, we think Russia's core interests in Europe are really important, just as important as our core interests vis-a-vis Taiwan. And so, what do? We judge each set of circumstances on their own merits. Well, that's a different formulation from the way the Chinese used to put things. They would always say, the Treaty of Westphalia is paramount. That's our cornerstone. No invading other countries. No violation of sovereignty. Blah, blah, blah. Okay? Chinese started not to say that anymore. What they said was, we look at each situation on its own merits, and we have the likings of a military as well as just a very fraternal strategic relationship. Now, that's a long way of setting the stage for the announcement that Biden is going to be meeting with Xi Jinping on Monday. So just right quick from when we speak here. What's he going to do? Well, I think that Xi Jinping is going to say, Mr. Biden, with all due respect, you made fun of my best friend. You insulted my best friend. We Chinese take insults very seriously. You said in your press conference last Wednesday evening that you didn't think we took Putin or the Russians very seriously. You didn't think we were worth much. That you denigrated my best friend Putin. Now, I don't like to see that, so I just want to say that in the beginning. Number two, we have this alliance here, and it's really cemented by the lack of statesmanship displayed by this fellow Blinken here and this fellow Sullivan over here. They don't realize, do they not realize that Russia and China are bound together now against the common enemy, and the common enemy is you, Mr. Biden? If you don't get that, you didn't seem to get it back in June of last year at the summit in Geneva with Putin. We'll get it now, okay? Because if things get out of hand for my best friend Putin in Europe, you're going to see some trouble in the South China Sea or opposite Taiwan. Do you really want to get involved in a two-front war with the two other peer competitors? I don't think so, Mr. Biden. So get rid of these guys. You won't probably say get rid of these advisors, but the implication would be clear. You get it now? These guys misled you a year and a half ago. You ought to understand that what socialist countries, particularly the Russians, the Soviets, used to call the world correlation of forces, okay? I mean, it's a basic concept. It's a balance of power 101, as John Mearsheimer says. The world correlation of forces has changed. How has it changed? Well, Mr. President, this is how it's changed. It used to be, if I can do this, used to be a sort of a triangle, right? Okay, where Russia, China, and the United States. Now, it's not an equilateral triangle any longer. It's an isosceles triangle. Now, maybe you don't remember your geometry, but an isosceles triangle is two big sides, two big lines, and one in the short that gets the short end of things, literally. You, Mr. President, are on the short end of things. And, you don't seem to realize that. But realize it now, because I'm telling you, man to man, if you don't cease and desist coming after both of us, you don't even hide it. You put it in your strategic doctrines. Lastly, Mr. President, I want you to consider something. We Chinese say, why can't we just get along? Why can't we have a win-win situation? Why do you always have to be number one? I mean, not only are you not number one anymore, but you're never going to be number one ever again when you're against China and Russia together. So think about it. Uh, do you have to act like an adolescent boy in making sure you always win the race? The race is pretty much clear now. We're going to be the world's strategic and economic power. Russia is our ally in all but name. Your advisors that say, "Oh well, yeah, it's not a defense alliance, it's not a military alliance." Well, Mr. Biden, that's a distinction without a difference. Don't try us. That's my concept of what President Xi is going to say to Biden. Now, whether it'll get through Biden's head or the heads of his elite advisors, I don't know, because it's really hard to retrain people who have been brought up and educated to think that they're exceptional, that they're indispensable. I think I think that's part of what makes these people do such stupid things. Maybe before I leave this little part here, I'm just gonna 2 weeks ago, Putin gave a really interesting speech at the Valdai conference. Okay, now he said lots of things. He talked for 45 minutes, and then the Q&A, the questions and answers, went for the rest of the 3.5 hours. Now, I don't think the New York Times or the Washington Post reporters hung around to hear the Q&A. They usually don't. They just go back and write something, and then, of course, the editors in New York and Washington write what they want to say. But here's what Putin said about the Chinese thing. It was the penultimate question. It was the next to the last question. So came at 3 hours and 25, okay? But here it is. You have to read these things if you want to know what's going on. He questioned the sanity of those who would, quote, spoil relations with China at the same time as they're supplying billions of weapons to Ukraine to fight against Russia. So is this sane, he says? Here's a quote. He's asked about the growing tensions between China and the United States over Taiwan. And Putin says this, quote, he's referring to Nancy Pelosi's visit, of course, quote, frankly, I do not know why they're doing this. Are they sane? It seems that this runs completely counter to common sense and logic. This is simply crazy. Continuing, it may seem that there is a subtle, profound plot behind this, but I think there is nothing like that. No subtle thought. It is just nonsense and arrogance, nothing else. Such irrational actions are rooted in arrogance and a sense of impunity. Now, arrogance and a sense of impunity is the world in which Blinken and Sullivan and most of the other advisors around Biden grew up. That's what they used to. That's why they talked down to the Chinese way back when, March of last year. That's why they continue to talk down to the Russians. And that's why Biden insulted Putin, referring to his talks with, upcoming talks with Xi, and saying that I don't think Xi takes Putin very seriously. I should probably get exactly what he says in that quote here. What is it? Here it is. Right. Yeah, well, there it is. Here's Biden gratuitously at this press conference Wednesday night. I don't think there's a lot of respect that China has for Russia or Putin. And I don't think they're looking at it as a particular alliance. Matter of fact, they've been sort of keeping their distance a little bit. Huh? So what are his advisors telling him? Well, they're telling him they're interpreting context in completely wrong ways. China says we're against nuclear weapons. Oh, so that's an implicit dig at Russia. Putin says, I understand there's concern in China and everybody else about Ukraine. Oh, so China is concerned. They're how does it say here? They're keeping their distance one from the other. Well, maybe, just maybe, on Monday, after talking with Xi Jinping, who is not inscrutable, he's a pretty up-in-your-face guy, maybe Biden will go to his advisors and say, I thought you told me that Russia was being squeezed by this guy, and he tells me that he's best friends with Putin. What's going on here? Why didn't you tell me that? Now, if that happens, and Biden is able to draw the logical conclusions from this, namely that you don't pick a fight with two major competitors on either side of the world, maybe he'll tuck tail in Ukraine and do the sensible thing by leaning on the Ukrainians to enter negotiations, because it's high time that Ukrainians stop getting killed by the thousands.
Got it. Ray, let's. I wanted the other day. I was talking with Jeffrey Sachs. I don't know if you know him or not.
I know of him.
Yeah, he was telling me something that it was. He says he believes that it wasn't an accident that that the U.S. tried to overthrow the governments in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. And he believes that all of that because these countries were allies of the Soviet Union. That's why the U.S. went after them. How do you evaluate his comments on the Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria?
Well, it's a little strong to say they were allies, but they were certainly sympathetic to the Soviet Union and to Russia. This takes us back to 1991 with the brilliant victory of the U.S. Armed Forces against Iraq. Now, Saddam Hussein had done that really stupid thing of invading Kuwait. So there was a just cause, a casus belli. And we all did ourselves proud as U.S. military against a very, very weak military on the part of the Iraqis. Now, what's my point here? Well, after that was accomplished, I remember that General Wesley Clark, who had been head of NATO, he went to Paul Wolfowitz, who was Deputy Secretary of Defense at the time, and he said, Paul, way to go. Great victory against Saddam Hussein. Now, what would you say the major lesson that you learned from this war in Iraq? And without batting an eyelash, Wolfowitz said, well, the big lesson is that we can do these things and Russia can't stop us. Now, there will come a time, says Wolfowitz, when they may be able to stop us. And so we've got to do everything we can now to make sure that we gather friendly nations around us to make sure that when that time comes, we'll have them in a condition where we still will be able to do whatever we want. 1991. Well, that's the same year that Wolfowitz and others wrote this defense guidance, which said, you know, we are the superpower in the world. We got to remain the superpower. So we have to make sure that no other country develops in such a way as it can really challenge us. So that was the policy, okay? Then you add to that the neocons who came in under George W. Bush. These people, well, how do you define a neocon? For most of them, you could say that they have great difficulty distinguishing between the strategic interests of the United States of America and those of Israel. Now, why do I say that? Well, the strike against Iraq was as much for Israel as it was for the other two factors I always mention, namely oil and the wish to establish permanent strategic bases in Iraq. Now, we're still there, but not in real strategic bases. The oil, that didn't work out so well. Not only U.S. companies, but others got the oil. How about Israel? We destroyed Saddam Hussein. We thought that would make that part of the world safer for Israel. Now, Afghanistan, well, it was 20 years of just sheer folly. I mean, Afghanistan, I know a little bit about history, and Afghan history is really interesting. You go way back before Christ to Alexander the Great. You know, he heard about this China, and he said, whoa, let me get there. They have great riches there, and we need to see China. And he had to go through, guess where? Afghanistan. And he learned, maybe first of all, that these Afghan people are really strange because they don't like foreigners coming into their country. And so his army was taking hits right and left on their flanks, and they had a council of war. And Alexander said, well, what are we going to do here? And they looked up and they saw these mountains, okay? And they said, well, you know, we're getting hit so much, and look what we have to course through. We may not make it. So let's go back to the Middle East and Central Asia where we know what the hell we're doing. And Alexander decided, yeah, we ought to do that. And he did. That's why they call him Alexander the Great. He changed his mind. He was sensible. Did the British do that? No. They got decimated. Armies got decimated. But did the Persians? Did the Indians? Did the Soviets? Did the U.S.? No, none of them. They hung on, the U.S. for as long as 20 years. What for? Well, one of the reasons was natural gas. What most people forget is that when George W. Bush was governor of Texas, a couple of years before he became president of the United States, he was a big oil man and a big gas guy. And he had the Taliban come to Texas and talk about opening what they called the Tapi pipeline. Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, onto the ocean. Tapi. Now, who's going to run that? Enron, the totally discredited corporation, okay? The gas fields in Turkmenistan are worth more than all the oil under the sand in Iraq in money. Most people don't know that. Caspian Sea, they have incredibly rich gas deposits. It was going to be a very lucrative thing. But what happened? Well, they went into Afghanistan, unlike Alexander the Great, they started a war, and the pipeline never got built. I had a chance to ask one of the authors of that whole project. What's his name now? I'll remember it in a second. He was one of the people that created the Wolfowitz doctrine. Minajad. I'll get it in a second. Anyhow, I asked him at a big meeting. It was a RAND authorized meeting. I said, well, whatever happened to the Tapi pipeline? And he said, oh, well, we couldn't build it because there was a war going on. I said, oh, so he really wanted to build it, but who started the war? Oh, well, we were trying to clean out we're trying to set up a good government in Afghanistan. So long story short, Afghanistan, not so much for Israel, a lot for that natural gas, and a lot for just showing that we would have a place there in Afghanistan, very, very close to China, common border with China, and then we have a strategic place. The other place is Syria. Well, Syria was again mostly for Israel. And, people don't realize this because people don't really get the right story from our mainstream press. But there was one exception. That came at a very curious juncture in U.S.-Russian relations. I'm talking 2013. There was a chemical attack outside of Damascus, a place called Ghouta. Okay. Now, we smelled a rat right away. It wasn't the Syrian army that mounted that attack. It was a false flag mounted by rebels supported by guess who, okay? Well, John Kerry got up at the State Department, he was Secretary of State, and he said no fewer than 35 times, Bashar al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad did this. We know he did it. Did he have an intelligence assessment? No. To my great surprise, my former colleagues stayed honest on that one. They wouldn't give an intelligence assessment that those chemical attacks were done by Bashar al-Assad. And so there was no intelligence assessment. The White House people put out a government assessment, which of course means crafted in the White House to justify attacking Syria. Now, Obama was president. He didn't want to start another war. We're talking at the end of August 2013. He surprises everybody by saying, before we start another war, we probably should go to Congress and get their authorization. What a strange, well, that's of course what you're supposed to do in the U.S. regime of things. Well, there were a lot of people saying, no, we have to attack Syria. Why? Well, for Israel, pure and simple. Now, what happened? Well, when all this was going on, the New York Times correspondent in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem actually, went and talked to her Israeli contacts. Now, when you're the New York Times bureau chief in Jerusalem, you get to talk to very high officials, and she did. And they took her aside and they said, here's how you explain what we want and what the U.S. wants. You asked, her name was Ruderin was her last name. She had asked, well, what's your preferred outcome in Syria? And one of them, a former consul at New York, is Alan Pincus was his name. He said, Jody, here's the thing. Our preferred outcome is no outcome. He said, traduisez, s'il vous plaît? No outcome? He said, yeah, as long as Sunni and Shia are killing each other off, Israel it has no real threat from Syria. And so it gets pretty bloody, but that's why we prefer no outcome. Well, she wrote that up. And in early September, that appeared as a lead story in the New York Times. I think it was around Labor Day, so the censors were off drinking martinis on Long Island. It must have happened because she got it in there. That's what they said. We prefer no outcome. What? Has there been an outcome in Syria? No outcome. Are the U.S. troops still there? Yeah. Where are they? Well, they're controlling some of the oil up in the north, and are the Russians there? Well, actually, the Russians came in 2015, didn't they? And they said, well, we don't want Bashar al-Assad to fall. And they prevented him from falling. So that's another reason why the neocons really, really hate the Russians. And what about the Syrian chemical thing? Again, the neocons were very angry at Putin because when Obama went up to St. Petersburg, early September, for an economic summit of some kind. He met with Putin, and Putin said, Obama, Mr. Obama, I got a deal for you. I know you don't want to start a war against Syria, an overt war. We know what you're doing in the covert side. So here's the deal. We have been working with the Syrians, and they have agreed to destroy all their chemical weapons under UN supervision on a ship specifically outrigged to destroy chemical weapons. You have several of those, Mr. Obama, and they're willing to do this, and that should get you off the hook here. That should pull those acorns out of the fire here. And Obama says, well, really? Kerry was not with Obama. Obama was pretty much alone. And Putin said, yeah, really. Watch the Syrian foreign minister make that announcement tomorrow, and he did. We're willing to destroy all our chemical weapons under UN supervision on a ship that's outrigged to destroy chemical weapons. Now, what was that all about? Well, that saved Obama from getting into another war. And 2 years later, talking to his biographer, Jeffrey Goldberg, he bragged about the fact that despite the advice of all his advisors, he violated the Washington playbook, his phrase, and decided not to start another war. Now, that was important. The neocons, who, as I say, have difficulty distinguishing between the strategic interests of the United States and those of Israel, they were angry as could be. I had a personal experience. Maybe this would be interesting. I was on the top of the CNN International building in Washington doing an interview with the BBC, small little room, a remote interview. And I came out, opened the door. Whoops, I almost knocked down this little fella. And I looked, it's Paul Wolfowitz. I said, oh, sorry, Paul. Wow, you got to watch what you're doing. Then I looked into the sea of people. There was Joe Lieberman right over there, a senator at the time. And they were watching the TV, and the TV guy was complaining about Obama not having the guts, Obama blowing the chance to have a war with Syria. This was terrible. What happens? Lieberman and Wolfowitz go off to this little room to be interviewed. And I'm watching him on the TV. And Wolfowitz says, President doesn't need to go to Congress to get authorization for this war. He doesn't have to do that. And they're just really criticizing Obama. Well, I said, this is too much. I always carry a copy of the Constitution in my back pocket. So I took it out and I underlined the article that says Congress and only Congress has the power to declare war, okay? And I tore out that article and I went into the elevator shaft where I knew that Lieberman and Wolfowitz would be coming out of their other room. And sure enough, they came. And I was all, looking pretty spiffy here. And you never know in Washington, you never want to admit that you don't know somebody who might be important. And maybe I didn't look important, but I was spiffy enough. So I said, Joe, and Paul. And they said, I hear Ray McGovern. And they acted as they didn't know me from Adam. I said, oh, yeah. Well, Paul, Joe, you said that Obama, the president, doesn't have to go to Congress to start a war. Now, you've been in the Senate 20 years. Here's Article 1 of the Constitution. You ought to take that home and read it because you're dead wrong. Well, Paul, don't go away. Paul Wolfowitz is slithering away. And finally, this 6-foot-tall, beautiful woman who was supposed to guard them and prevent them from being accosted by people like me, appeared on the scene and she said, oh, gentlemen, I'm so sorry. And I said, well, I'm really sorry, too. Why do you have these guys that don't know what the Constitution says on your programs? Well, it went down from there. and I haven't been on CNN since, okay? But what's the point here? The point is that they were so irate. They were so angry at missing their chance for a war, for what uh, Jody Ruderen's interlocutors called a war that wouldn't necessarily have any end, no preferred outcome in Syria. Why? So that Israel would be protected. In any case, the rest of the story is that it only took 6 months for the people, these neocons, to prepare the coup on the streets of Kiev. And we have a situation where in September of 2013, the apogee, the height of U.S., Russian cooperation in preventing war in Syria, go downhill to February 22nd, 2014, when these same people that wanted to stir up trouble in Syria caused the coup in Kiev, had the people all prearranged to make the coup. It was the most blatant coup in history because it was advertised 2.5 weeks before on YouTube. Many of your audience probably know that, but in a word, Victoria Nuland, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs at the time, was caught on the telephone with Jeffrey Pyatt, our ambassador in Kiev at the time, and they're plotting this coup. They're naming the people they're going to appoint, like Yats is the guy for Yatsenyuk, and they're saying, among other things, we checked with Jake Sullivan, who's the national security advisor to the then Vice President Joe Biden. And Jake tells us that Joe is ready to glue this thing together. If we need an international personality to come in and endorse this thing, he's ready to do that. Now, when did that appear on YouTube? On the 4th of February, 2014. When I saw that, I said, wow, poor Yatsenyuk, the guy who was going to be prime minister. All these coup plans, it's been blown. You blow a coup by revealing it ahead of time, right? And so did Putin. Because Putin stayed in Sochi at the Winter Olympics. His advisors told him what I would have told them. Well, there was this coup attempt, but now it's been revealed. They won't do it. But they did. 2.5 weeks later, 22nd of February, there's a coup on the Maidan. The new government comes in and says, we're going to become members of NATO. We're going to make sure that Russian is not an official language. And, what else? Well, the last thing I'll say on this is that when Putin and his advisors conferred the next day, that is, on the 23rd of February, 2014, the big thing, of course, was they're going to join NATO. Well, our main naval port is in Sevastopol in Crimea. We can't possibly allow our main naval port to go to NATO. And so let's have a plebiscite. We know they're mostly Russian people there. They'll probably vote to rejoin Russia. And they did. Now, the point is this, that a month after the plebiscite, a month after the annexation of Crimea into Russia, Putin got up and said, people ask me about the reasons why we did this. Okay, well, I'll tell you. We didn't want them to join NATO. That's one. But even more important, got that? Even more important, we didn't want to see medium range or intermediate range ballistic missiles in Crimea. Whoa. Where are there already holes for those kinds of missiles in Romania, in Poland. What does that mean to Russia strategically? It means that you could put cruise missiles in these holes. They call them capsules, of course. Put cruise missiles in these holes, and they can reach Moscow in between 7 and 10 minutes. If you put hypersonic missiles in there, 5 minutes. How do I know this? Well, not only did Putin say that, but I've had all kinds of confirmation from my military intelligence specialist friends. So yeah, that's right. It's the same threat that John F. Kennedy faced in 1962, almost exactly 60 years ago. What do I mean? Well, we found out that the Soviets had put medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba with nuclear warheads, and they were in range of Washington, Omaha, Nebraska, the headquarters of the Strategic Air Command, and how quickly could they hit those sites? Just minutes is as close as I can get. That's what the strategic, so just minutes. So what did Kennedy do? Well, you may not remember, I was in the Army at the time. What he did was, there's going to be a blockade of Cuba. Blockade of Cuba. Well, isn't that illegal? Yeah, it is illegal. Did we think that was unprovoked? No. What else did he do? Well, I just escaped. I was just a little bit late to join the raiding party assembled in South Florida to go in and overturn Castro's government. Well, is that legal? Well, not so much. Kennedy also threatened to use nuclear weapons. So when a large power feels an existential threat that comes on his doorstep, a large power reacts. And did Kennedy break the law? Of course he broke the law. Did anybody say, John Kennedy, you broke the law? No. Why? Because he was provoked. Now, just to finish up this little thing, was Putin unprovoked in invading Ukraine? Well, we know about the NATO-trained army that was about to pounce on Donetsk and Lugansk. We know about the neo-Nazis throughout the Kiev government. What people don't know, which is very apparent, is that the same medium-range ballistic missile threat faces Putin the same way that it faced John Kennedy. If U.S. missiles are put in these holes, he faces exactly the same threat that those medium-range ballistic missiles pose to Omaha, Nebraska, to New York, to Washington. Now, Putin complained in December of last year, look, that would give me cruise missiles. If they were put in these, well, they call them ABM sites. U.S. calls them ABM sites. They're in the wrong place for ABM sites. And they were justified initially as defending against Iranian missiles. I mean, it was all made up stuff, okay? So anyhow, they call them ABM sites. What Putin says, that if cruise missiles, Tomahawks, for example, Putin said Tomahawk missiles are put in these things. Cruise missiles are rather slow. It will take 7 to 10 minutes to hit Moscow. Hypersonic missiles, 5 minutes. I, Putin, don't want to be faced with the decision in 5 minutes whether I blow up the rest of the world. Now, he didn't say that explicitly, but he has said close to that. So why is the U.S. doing this? Why can't there be an accommodation where we can work out the same kind of arrangement that was worked out by Gorbachev and Reagan and the first George H.W. Bush. Why can't they do a limitation of this range, this kind of range ballistic missiles? They did it before. They signed it in 1987, and who got out of it? Trump in 2019. So there's no reason in God's heaven why they can't get together and discuss these things and stop trying to prevail, as the U.S. administration keeps saying, for as long as it takes in Ukraine. It's not going to work. If you look at the map, you see advantage, Russia. Does Russia have to use nuclear weapons? No. That's all made up stuff. Has Putin threatened to use tactical nuclear weapons? No. That's all made up too. All he has done is reminded the world that, look, when push comes to shove, if our nation is endangered, or if somebody uses a nuclear weapon on us, we will not hesitate to use our nuclear retaliatory force. Last thing I'll say on this is that last time Putin won election, he was traveling around, people were congratulating him. And one person said, now, Mr. Putin, if you were attacked with strategic nuclear missiles from the West, and there was nothing you could do to defend against it, would you retaliate to blow up the rest of the world too? Or what would you do? He looked straight at that person and he said, what would the world be without Russia? What would the world be without Russia? Do I think that Putin, under attack, would say, let's save the rest of the world? I don't know, but you don't want to take that chance, okay? Well, I've talked quite a bit here. Maybe I ought to give you a chance to ask another question.
Yeah, Ray, the other thing, if you remember, in our other interview, I asked you why Europe is so much in the hands of the US. I asked the same question to Jeffrey Sachs. He said something, I think we can discuss it here. He said that Europe is not a one big country. It's 44 countries that the United States can easily manipulate these countries. And we have the countries on the eastern part of Europe, especially Poland, that has a great animosity against Russians, and they don't like Russians. He said they don't like Russians, if we want to put it in the correct sentence. And the other thing that I saw on CNN, Fareed Zakaria, he is a journalist of CNN. He had an interview with the Finland's president, in which he asked, after this change in government in Italy, the right wing, these three parties that joined and won the election, and he said, he asked the Finland's president, is it of concern for Europe policy that Italy gonna change their policy on Ukraine? And he responded something so interesting, so amazing. He said, no, there is no concern, because Italy is not in a good shape economically. They need financial aid from the EU, so they have to abide by EU's policy in Ukraine. I was thinking that we have two big economy in Europe. We have Germany, we have Italy, but if a country like Italy cannot get its voice heard by other members of EU, how we can imagine anybody else can talk? Those small countries, and nobody gonna understand this. And we know the EU policy is not the EU policy, is the US policy. That how what's your take on the whole issue?
Well, I'll address your questions here, but I'd like to adduce one example, and that's the Swedes. Now, there was a time Olaf Palme and other good Swedish statesmen, neutral people who one could look up to and say, well, can you help us negotiate on Vietnam or things like that? I don't know what happened in Sweden, but Sweden now is very much under the thumb of the United States. Witness the fact that the Swedes have said, you're not going to look at those pipelines that were sabotaged by we don't know who. You're not going to look at those Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines. That's our business. We're going to collect that. We don't want any other investigations. Well, hello? Who do you suppose did that? Who do you suppose orchestrated the destruction of those 2 pipelines? Well, there's only one plausible candidate, and it's the country that I live in, okay? Now, why do I pick on the Swedes? Well, one of my heroes is a young man named Julian Assange. He's a friend of mine. And he was unveiling U.S. war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan and other chicanery in diplomatic circles around the world. And the U.S. was out to get him. How did they get him? From the Swedes. Julian made the mistake of being in Copenhagen, giving a speech. And then he had an affair with actually 2 women. And they were anxious. They were, they only wanted Julian to be tested as to whether he had AIDS. And they asked him, and he said, no, I've just been tested before. I don't. I need to go on to Britain. And so they said, well, now let's go to the police and see if we can make Julian Assange get tested for AIDS. And they went to the police, and they said, no, this was all consensual. We don't want to lodge a complaint about Julian Assange. This was all on the up and up. There was no rape involved. We just want to know, can we force Julian to take an AIDS test? Well, what did the police do? No doubt, in my view, with the help of some friendly liaison services, they accused, pure and simple, they accused Assange of rape. The women were distraught, angry, because that's hardly what they wanted to have happen. But that's what they put in the press, and that's eventually how they got Julian in detention. And for the rest of that was what in detention now. So that's the Swedes. Now, you asked about the Finns, but there was also another one you asked about. Well, let's do the Finns. The Finns and the Swedes, I think, are an example of the kind of corruption that exists within governments of various countries, but also within the hoi aristoi, the moneyed, privileged classes who are the beneficiaries of, let's say, U.S. largesse, okay? So you have people like that beautiful woman in Finland, like the people in Sweden. They say, oh yeah, let's join NATO. Well, what was the Russian reaction? I was debating a person on TV just 2 weeks ago, and he said, well, if the Russians didn't react at all, I said, that's just fine. Well, they did react. What the Russians said is, look, we have a 800-mile border with you guys. We've been able to get along ever since we beat you back when you joined the Nazis during World War II. We've been able to get along. And we could still get along as long as you don't put NATO infrastructure in your country. What is NATO infrastructure? Those holes that I was talking about, those capsules, those emplacements where they could fire cruise missiles or Tomahawk cruise missiles or hypersonic missiles right into Russia. In that case, maybe 3 or 4 minutes warning, launch to target. So it's a worry for Russia. And how one explains how the Finns and the Swedes and even the Swiss, for God's sake, even the Swiss have come around to do things that they never did before against Russia. Well, I'll tell you my guess, and it's simply that when you demonize Putin, you demonize Russia for 6 whole years, and you blame Russia for giving the world Donald Trump. I have to confess here, my wife always says that I need to say that I think Donald Trump is the worst president the United States ever had. And I was saying that long before the insurrection of January 6th, okay? But if you accuse the Russians of hacking into the DNC, of manipulating all manner of things so Trump would win and then, blacken him with trying to reach out to Russia, well, then after 6 years of this stuff, your media has brainwashed, and I use the term explicitly, brainwashed the people into thinking the Russians are a big threat. The Russians want to take over not only Ukraine, but the rest of Europe. Now, guess what? There isn't a scintilla of evidence that the Russians want, a la the Soviet Union, to take over the rest of the world, or take over the rest of Europe, or even take over Ukraine. They just want a safe Ukraine that doesn't threaten Russia the way the emplacement of Soviet missiles in Cuba threatened John Kennedy and the United States. So you had one other question there that escapes me
about
now.
Italy, because
Italy.
they said, the Finland's president said that Italy cannot do anything to change EU policy on Ukraine because they need financial aid from the EU. That's why they have to abide by the EU's policy.
Well, Jeffrey Sachs is much more educated and wise on economic things. Lately, I take his word as gospel. He knows it in and out. Not only does he know Italy, but he knows Poland, and that was the other the other country you mentioned. The Poles hate the Russians. Well, all right. So what do? Well, Jeffrey Sachs went into Poland, and he fixed up their economy in a very, very rational way, and got the U.S. to approve that. And that's largely why Poland is, I won't say flourishing, but it's getting along today. Now, here's the key. Jeffrey Sachs did the same thing with respect to reorganize the Russian economy. The same kind of plan. It would have put the Russians in good shape during the 90s, okay? What did Washington say? Niet. No, we're not going to help the Russians that way. Oh, wow. Jeffrey has confessed in public that he was astounded. Why discriminate against the Russians that way when you're trying to help the East Europeans get back on their feet, or the people in Eastern Europe? So who knew about all this? Who watched all this? Well, a fellow named Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. He was at Yeltsin's side during a lot of this. He saw how that drunken Russian president gave away the family jewels, let U.S. corporations plunder what was left of the Soviet economy, and more than that, on a human scale. Most people don't remember this, but I get this statistic from the World Bank, okay? So I didn't make it up. What's the word? Russian males in 1991 had a life expectancy of 63 years old. Russian males in 1995, just 4 years later, had a life expectancy 57. Do the math. 6 years less life expectancy in 4 or 5 years of that kind of plundering of what was left of the Soviet economy. That speaks to me. Who watched all that? Putin. Now, what's the miracle here? I kind of think that we have to acknowledge miracles. Yeltsin, that drunk that we got reelected, and that's no secret to anyone, in 1996 when he was losing the election, we came in big with the IMF and the World Bank and all those Harvard guys to advise him, and he won. So that was another 4 years. Why was it that Yeltsin, pretty much on his deathbed, picked Putin as his successor? My guess is that he realized, as drunks often do, what terrible, terrible things he was responsible for, and thought, well, this guy's really bright. He's got integrity. He's certainly an effective guy, so let's make him president. Now, that was at the very end of 1999, 2000. So Putin's been around for 22 years. What has he done to the Russian economy, the Russian armed forces? They're as strong as Russia has ever been. And when he gets together with Xi Jinping, well, here's a fellow who has lifted some 600 million people out of poverty in China.
We have three countries in that region, in that zone. We have Germany that never do such a thing to itself. We have Poland, and we have Sweden. It seems that Sweden didn't know anything about this because they started investigating the issue, this problem, and they found something. I don't know. They don't want to share it, but it seems that the only country that remains in that circle of three countries is Poland. Poland. Right after the sabotage, we have the Sikorsky congratulating the United States. We have Liz Truss. Now this week, Liz Truss said it's done. It seems that it was a collaboration of the United States, UK, and Poland. Poland, because the Poland's beside it's next to the pipeline that it could. And after that, they receive an award because they have the new pipeline from Norway. It seems that two birds, one stone for Poland. How do you see this?
Well, the Russians, as you know, have accused the British. And they say that they are giving the evidence to the UN. The Russians keep giving evidence to the UN, and the UN, for some reason, doesn't take it quite seriously or puts it in some kind of bottleneck where it's not given appropriate attention. In any case, the Russians keep doing that. I think this will be discussed at the UN, the actual evidence that, as the Russians put it, the UK was involved. Now, the UK has these kinds of capabilities. Their special forces do. And it's, people tell me, inconceivable that it could be done without Sweden on purpose looking the other way, because that Baltic Sea is pretty much a NATO lake. So, whether it's the British or the Poles or both, or the U.S. involved in it, the only way you figure out, who did it is cui bono. Cui bono, who profits? It's not really hard to understand. Uh, the only people that profit are the people that were warning about the Nord Stream being a very, very dangerous thing because it makes Europe dependent on Russian gas. Uh, there is liquefied natural gas that's being supplied now at very high prices by the U.S., so there's some profiteering going on there. But most of all, look at it this way. When the Russians announced that, whoops, the explosive people, the saboteurs, didn't succeed in sabotaging all four pipelines. There are two pipelines for Nord Stream 1 and 2 for Nord Stream 2. So they didn't succeed. As a matter of fact, one of them still works. And Putin was asked, well, could that one be used? And he said, of course. But the Germans would have to agree to it. Now, German industry is falling apart. A lot of the big corporations are moving where? To the United States. German people are going to be very cold this winter. So is there any limit to how subservient the Germans will be when they see that their only hope of keeping warm this winter or preventing their industries from going completely kaput, in the German word, is to turn on that other pipeline. Now, it wouldn't be enough to substitute for what they had intended to get from the whole Nord Stream 2. It would be something. Now, are the Germans not able to stand up on their own 2 feet and say, look, it makes no sense to blame the Russians for sabotaging their own pipeline. Somebody else did it. Somebody who wishes us ill. Now, one of the pipes still works. Why can't we turn it on? Okay. Well, they haven't even been able to do that yet. And as far as the Russians are concerned, well, Putin is working out a deal with Turkey. There are ways to get this natural gas to Europe and go through Turkey. And Erdogan is clapping his hands because it's going to make Turkey still more wealthy. So what's going on there? Well, what I can say is this, that I have been amazed that the German people, and I know them well, I lived there for 5 years, bright and sensitive as they are, that they can't stand up to the U.S. 77 years after the end of the war. That's a long time. I've been saying for 10 years now that at some point the Germans are going to stand up and say, no, our interests come first, not your interests disguised as NATO's interests, not yours, but ours. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here. This is different. This is German industry imploding. This is German people putting on 5 overcoats, okay? I think this time the Germans may simply say, enough. Now, if they do, how are they going to operate in this EU? Well, the truth be told, the rest of the EU doesn't very much like the German policy. The Germans have put in all kinds of incentives so that their people can pay for the more expensive fuel to heat their homes and stuff. That's not really playing a fair game with the others. So it looks like for the first time in 77 years, in my view, things are going to just sort of dissolve. And the EU will be seen as some kind of creature of the United States, which it pretty much is. And the antagonism between the United States and Germany in the first instance, and the rest of them, France, Italy, and so forth, in the second instance, and the UK. I mean, between the United States, UK, and the rest of them is going to just get more intense. Now, what really doesn't compute in my view is that the wise people that write for the Washington Post and work for our administration don't get it. Here's one example. David Ignatius, who writes in the Washington Post, he usually takes dictation from the CIA, whatever they say. He's made the big point today that the Russians are isolated. The Russians are losing out in the UN. Every little body is just marginalizing Russia. Well, give me a break. Russians aren't losing out. The Russians are not isolated. All you have to do is think about this alliance that we're talking about with Xi Jinping of China, and you've got almost most of the world. Tuck in India, which has not gone along with the sanctions and other repressive measures. Tuck in South Africa, Iran, Argentina wants to join the BRICS. Put them all together and you've got far more people than you have in what I call the lily white West. Look at them. Look at NATO. What's distinctive about NATO? All white. The closest you can come to people of color are the Turks, and they're sort of wiggly-washy about NATO themselves. But you have the lily white West against the rest of the world, for God's sake. Okay? Now, I like to joke, and I say the Russians have been blackened so much by U.S. propaganda that they're people of color too, and actually some of them ethnically are people of color. But you have the white against the rest of the world, and the white has this heritage of having been the colonialists that took advantage of the rest of the world. So, I expect to see, still in my lifetime, a devolvement, a kind of a bifurcation of these two worlds. And I describe it more as a bipolar. It's in the psychiatric sense as well. It's a bipolar division. Multipolar, okay. There's China, India, Russia, but bipolar in the sense that it's the West, NATO, white, against the rest of the world. Now, that's not healthy. That's really bad. And hopefully we can navigate through this mess by negotiations and by finally realizing that we can't be the sole indispensable, the sole exceptional country in the world. Now, when I lecture at colleges or universities, I ask them about these words, indispensable. I say to them, do you know what a synonym is? And usually there are a couple of people like, oh yeah, that's a like word, a like word. Right, okay. What's an antonym? Well, probably one or two will say, yeah, that's an opposite word. That is the opposite word, okay. So I say, okay, good. Now let's take indispensable. What's the antonym for indispensable? And they stroke their chin and I guess it's dispensable. I said, that's right. You get it? By definition, all other countries are dispensable. And then they say, wow, I wonder how other countries feel about being dispensable. I'll tack on one other comment here because we talked a little bit about what I call the apogee, the height of U.S.-Russian cooperation preventing a war in Syria in September 2013. Guess what? Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. It appeared on the 12th of September, 2013. What did he say? Well, it was a nice little rundown of how the cooperation between our two countries, Russia and the United States, had prevented a wider war in Syria. And then there was this very curious last paragraph. It said, quoting, well, Putin wrote it, he said, you know, I really am grateful for the increasing trust between our two countries and between President Obama and me personally. I do object strenuously to the notion that any country is exceptional. President Obama talked in his most recent speech last week about how the U.S. is exceptional. I disagree. I think all countries are equal. I think that there are some that are farther along toward democracy. There are others that are struggling with various things. But when God looks down at countries of the world, God sees them as all equal. Period. End quote. Now, I was told at the time by some pretty good sources that Putin penned that last paragraph himself. Okay? And I got some confirmation of a kind about 3 years later when he was interviewed. It was a spontaneous response to this same kind of question. How do you feel about people being indispensable or exceptional? And he said the same thing in almost exactly the same words. So I think he did pen that last paragraph. And what he says, I have to say, is true. We Americans are not indispensable, surely, and we're not even exceptional. I believe that we're supposed to get along with all countries, that we shouldn't pretend to be the master or to dominate the rest of the world. And this, this has been our policy. I mentioned Wolfowitz doctrine, but it goes back to 1948. 1948, 3 years after the war, there was a new policy planning staff set up in the State Department, headed by George Kennan. George Kennan, the Soviet expert that I learned so much from, that was sort of like a mentor to me in those days. What did Kennan say? This was revealed later. In the first document that this unit put out, Kennan wrote, we have domain over 50% of the wealth in the world, but we only represent 6.3% of the population. Therefore, our policy has to be crafted in such a way as to maintain this disparity. We cannot be fooled by soft issues like civil rights or other things that are not strategic. It will come down eventually to hard power that we need to exert, period, end quote. Now, that was the mindset. And in those days, having survived the war without a lot of damage except for Pearl Harbor, where the rest of the world was on its back, it was possible for people like this, and Kennan was, I confess, an elitist, to think, well, Americans have most of the wealth, 50% of the world's wealth, and we have, we want to live the way we want to live, so we got to keep this disparity, as he calls it. Now, wow, is that what I believe should be the case? No. Is that what Putin believes should be the case? No. So, call me a Putin, say I'm in Putin's pocket, if you will, but I think there should not be any concept of exceptional or indispensable countries. You know, I have a faith aspect to this. I'm a Catholic, and at their best, the United States Catholic bishops have issued some very strong declarations. You have to go back to the 80s, but they're there, okay? And their most important declaration has to do with what we've just been talking about. It's called a preferential option for the poor. Now, that sounds really pretty nice, doesn't it? Well, those bishops spell that out for us. You know what they said? If you want to be a Catholic, okay, here's the preferential option for the poor. No one is entitled to accumulate still more of what he or she doesn't need when other people are deprived of the bare necessities of life. Period. End quote. That's the new theology. That's what people in Brazil and the rest of Latin America practiced at the hands of many of these enlightened